Well, I'm Roger Hertog, chairman of the Tikva Fund, and let me welcome you all to what I think will be a really interesting evening. And it's about, I think, an important book. So let me just say, it's an honor to introduce the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Like me, I will bet most of you read the Jerusalem Post online, because it's a way to really get very high-quality information about what's happening in Israel. The author of this great new book is called Shadow Strike. And Shadow Strike is the story of Israel's secret mission to eliminate the Syrian nuclear power. His name is Yaakov Katz. Yaakov was born in Chicago, now lives in Jerusalem with his wife and family. Among his prior books, which was another terrific book, The Weapon Wizards, How Israel Became a High-Tech Military Superpower. Before I'm going to begin our conversation with Yaakov, let me just put some contextual history so that everyone gets a sense of the backdrop to this story. I think you'll quickly understand why it's important. It's 2007 in America. It's late 2007. The Republicans have just lost the House and the Senate. We're doing terribly in Iraq. Bush's approval ratings are near the low of its presidency. And at that very moment, he makes a courageous decision and announces not only will we will be not leaving Iraq, but he is going to order another 30,000 troops to go to Iraq with an effort to win the war. Israel is then being led by Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who has just experienced a military setback in Lebanon in 2006, on top of which the media, political insiders, are trumpeting that Olmert is likely to be indicted for bribery and corruption. With that stage set of the political environment, our story begins in April of 2007, when a short, burly, balding man who happens to be head of the Mossad, Maya Dagan, comes to the White House for a clandestine meeting with Steve Hadley, Bush's national security advisor, Elliot Abrams, the deputy national security advisor for the Middle East, and, surprisingly, the vice president of the United States, Dick Cheney. So, Yaakov, I think the best way to start, let's presume we were eavesdropping on that first pivotal meeting. And the book actually almost makes you feel you are there. What was the reason that the head of the Mossad came to meet in secret with the vice president and two of Bush's national security advisors? Second part of the question is, what did he want the United States to do? And related to this, what did Maya Dagan show them? And if you can, how did Israel get the information that Dagan was about to show them?
Well, before I answer, I just have to say thank you very much to Roger, who's really been a great friend and counsel. And I think it was last summer that I had the opportunity to have lunch with Roger here in New York City. And I was at the end of the book. I had written an ending to the book, but it didn't feel right. And I'm sitting with Roger at lunch, and I'm telling him it over, and he gave me this frame of mind of how to think about the ending of the book. And that's what I wrote. So the ending is very much the seed that Roger planted in my mind at that lunch about statesmanship, and we'll talk about that as well. So thank you very much, Roger, and thanks for having me tonight. Mayor Dagan, who was the head of the Mossad, came to Washington, D.C. just a few weeks after a couple of Mossad agents had raided a hotel room in Vienna, Austria. Israel, for a number of months, had this feeling that something was happening in Syria in the nuclear realm, but they couldn't put their finger on it. And Syria was known to have a nuclear reactor that it got from the Chinese sometime in like the 1990s that had a staff of maybe 12, 13 people. Nothing, excuse me, nothing serious. But something was going on. And they heard of Ibrahim Otman, who was the director of the Syrian Atomic Energy Agency, who was traveling to Vienna for meetings at the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is based in Vienna. And the Mossad agents decided to raid this guy's hotel room. Now, you say that as if it's like a simple operation. You just break into the hotel room. So Ehud Olmert in his office had on the wall, I mean, to this detail, the Prime Minister of Israel is involved in where the cars are, where the getaway car is going to be on the street, where the agents go in from, where they could potentially escape from. That's the detail that the Prime Minister has. Anyhow, they go in there and they download his computer. And they come back, and here's the typical Israeli story, right? Because after all, it is Israel. They come back with the material, and the Mossad brings it to the military intelligence guys in the army, in the IDF, and they say, can you process it for us? Now, they forgot to put on the one word on it, urgent. So 2 to 3 weeks go by, and then they get the material. And when they get the material, they discover that they have photos of a reactor core, of fuel rods, and the kicker was Ibrahim Otman, the Syrian scientist, posing for a photo in front of the reactor, with a man of Asian ethnicity wearing one of these blue tracksuits, whose name was Chon Chibu, who is the head of the Yongbyon nuclear complex in North Korea. Dagan obviously brings this to Olmert, presents it to him. And there's a whole side story. You mentioned Olmert's investigation. So the day he comes to Olmert, and he's sitting in the office, him, 2 of his deputies, and Ehud Olmert, presenting him with the intelligence for the first time. There's a knock on the door. And Olmert yells, "Go away." And the knock persists, and the door opens, and it's Olmert's media advisor, spokesperson. And the spokesperson, Olmert says, "Get the hell out of here. I'm busy." And the spokesperson says, "But Mr. Prime Minister, Channel 2 News," that's the big nightly newscast, now its name has changed to Channel 12, is about to come out with a report of another criminal investigation against you. We have to give them a response. So, Olmert is sitting there grappling with a reality that has now changed completely. Israel is now facing an existential threat. At the same time, he's got to give a stupid response to some news report. But he sends Dagan to Washington to bring this intelligence to the Americans and to update them. You mentioned Cheney. Cheney wasn't supposed to be in that meeting. Olmert had called and asked that Bush meet with Dagan. But the Americans said that's a little breaking protocol, because you don't just, a foreign intelligence chief doesn't just get to meet the president. So they decided to bring him into Hadley's office. He'll meet with Hadley and his deputy Elliott. And then Cheney heard about this and said, this is interesting. He knew Dagan. He knew that Olmert wouldn't make such a call like that. And he decided to sit in on the meeting. And Cheney goes on to play a very important role in this whole story. But what Israel wanted at that first stage was to bring the Americans up to speed, to give them the intelligence, let them start their verification process, because that's what America had to do. But ultimately, the main objective was to get the United States to attack and destroy the reactor. That was what Israel really wanted.
So just give me, because I'm diverting from my questions already, because it's one of these little pieces, fabulous piece of information. So just tell us a couple of sentences about Dagan and the picture in his office.
Mayor Dagan was born on a train that was fleeing Poland towards Ukraine sometime in, I think it was 1945, just as the war was ending in Europe. He came to Israel. He's a fascinating character. In Hebrew we have a saying called someone who fights im sakin ben hashinaim, with a dagger between his teeth. That was Mayor Dagan throughout his career. Right? From when he first joined the IDF, Ariel Sharon identified him early on as someone with literally killer instincts, with the ability to adapt and to fight, a courageous warrior. Had him establish a unit called Sayeret Rimon, which back in the 1950s, when we were having these raids of Arab terrorists from Gaza into Israel, they were going into Gaza disguised as fishermen, disguised as women, disguised as whatever, and they were taking out these terrorists inside their homes, inside their beds, before Fauda, right, wherever it was ever created. Right? This was the original Fauda. And Dagan climbed the ranks of the IDF. He carried out special operations in Lebanon on behalf of Menachem Begin, together with the Lebanese Christians and all that. And then in 2000, we had Ephraim Halevi, who I'm sure you know well, who was the head of the Mossad. And Ephraim Halevi, fantastic guy, very smart, very deep intellectual, but more a diplomat than a fighter. And the Mossad, he was brought in because if you remember in Netanyahu's first term in office, there was that botched assassination in Amman of Khalid Masha. And they decided that the Mossad needs to take it down a notch. They brought back Ephraim, who had been deputy head of the Mossad, but then was sent off to be ambassador to the EU, because that's what he's more about. They brought him back to straighten out the Mossad, but the Mossad lost its fighter character. And Sharon felt it when he came as prime minister, and he decided to bring Dagan in and gave him that one mission, which is to take down Iran and to undermine Iran's nuclear program. That was the primary mission. In his office at Mossad headquarters just north of Tel Aviv, there was a photo of an older man wearing a talit, a prayer shawl, somewhere in Europe, black and white, with two Nazi officers standing over him, one holding a rifle over his shoulder, another one holding a stick. It was Mayor Dagan's grandfather. And Dagan would tell people when they visited his office, "This is my grandfather. I look at this picture every day, so I remember what happened to us and what we can never let happen to us again." That's that photo.
And after the photo was taken, I thought
His grandfather was killed.
His
Yeah.
grandfather
was
killed.
murdered.
Yeah. Okay. So now we've three of them have sat there. They've seen this information. So how did the Bush administration go about making this decision? Who outside the national security team did the Americans consult to come up with a recommendation for the president? And what was the reasoning, ultimately, behind the president's national security team for deciding against U.S. action?
So that's about half the book, those
Okay.
questions. Right.
I'm trying to, I mean, you know, we took a little time
we
there.
took a little
We
time.
had a little diversion.
I'll tell you, for 10 years, Israel was quiet, never said a word about this. And some stories did come out on the American side, because America had to eventually, Bush had to go to Congress, and there were all these different stories. But if you looked at all the media reports, this always blew my mind. It was as if, so we know that Dagan comes to Washington in April, and we know that on July 13th, Bush calls Olmert and says, "I'm not attacking." And if you read any news report, it's as if we jumped from April to July, like nothing happened. Okay, what happened between April and July? So I met with everyone I could, at least on the American side. And what immediately happened in the immediate aftermath of that meeting, Dagan, after he went to the White House, he went across town to Langley, shared the intelligence with Mike Hayden, who was the head of CIA at the time. The CIA started with the whole verification process of the intelligence, right? They had identified the building, but they never knew what it was, just from satellite footage, a sweeping of Syria. They didn't know what it was. They had to see that these photos were real, that they were doing, and other ways of collecting intelligence. Within the White House, Bush created two groups. The first was the principals. So that was Cheney, Hayden, Secretary of State Rice, Secretary of Defense Gates, the Chief of Staff, the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff. And those were the people who were gathering almost on a weekly basis in Hadley's office, and they were talking about the issue. What should we do? On the lower level, you had what they called the drafting group. Each of the principals appointed a deputy to be part of this group, and these were the guys who were doing the heavy lifting. So you had Elliot Abrams from Hadley. You had Eric Edelman from Gates. You had Elliot Cohen, who was the counselor in the State Department from Rice. You had Steve Kappas, who was Michael Hayden's guy. And they would gather, and you had James Jeffrey also, and who's now within the administration, right? And you had these guys, and they would sit there, and they would come up, and they tried to think up ideas. And there are a lot of little side stories to all this, right? You know, their first meeting in the White House Situation Room, they're sitting around the table, they're just getting settled in, door opens up, Bush is standing there. Bush, it's the president, he doesn't just walk in on meetings. That doesn't happen usually. And they all jump up, and he says to them, "If one word leaks out, I fire all of you. All of you get fired." It was an amazing experience. Everyone I talked to within that team spoke about how this was the way a government is meant to handle these types of issues. Remember, not a word leaked out. Not a word leaked out here, not a word leaked out in Israel. That itself is fascinating. But the groups, what they were doing was that they were coming up with different ideas. So their first idea was we could attack, right? They spoke with the army, they came up with the plan, pretty easy, sent a couple of stealth bombers, they were within range, dropped their munitions, done, story over. That's something America's never done. America doesn't just go in and randomly attack another country's infrastructure. That's one thing that was considered. And then there were special operations that were considered also. That was deemed not to succeed, have a greater chance to succeed because special forces wouldn't be able to carry as much explosives with them as you could with like a B-2 bomber. Then you had diplomatic tracks. We'll just go straight to the IAEA or to the United Nations. In the end, they came up with a hybrid. James Jeffrey, he pretty much was the guy who came up with this concept of what we'll do is we will, sorry, I'll tell you another thing. They thought, one idea they came up with was we'll attack, there was a water pump because the reactor was built along the Euphrates River because a reactor needs to get water to cool it and then it has to dispense of the heated water. So it was close to the Euphrates River. So one of the ideas was we'll bomb just the water pump, we won't bomb the reactor. And we'll kind of threaten them that way. That was thrown aside. In the end, the bottom line was that what they presented the president with was we go to the IAEA, we go to the UN Security Council, and we retain for ourselves the option still of attacking. We need proof of this reactor. That was what they came up with. But I really think, ultimately, Roger, that it had to do with is what you opened with. They're in Iraq. They're in Afghanistan. They are bogged down in these wars. The president is not popular. The last thing he needs is another conflict with another Arab Muslim state. And that's really, I think, what was the bottom line.
Let's pull this thread a little longer. So it would be equally interesting, and this is why the book is really valuable, because you see it, this decision-making from both sides. It isn't just the U.S. You now get to understand it from the Israeli perspective, which is quite impressive, by the way. Mm-hmm. But it'd be interesting to learn the decision-making processes of the Israelis. As we know, Olmert had plenty of problems at home. Yet once he told Bush, and I quote, when Bush told him he wasn't going to do anything, Olmert said, "I will destroy the nuclear reactor." Period. Israel went through an immensely sophisticated, elaborate planning process. Give us some idea of that process, who Olmert conferred with, how many people were actually aware of the strategy, and how here again, how is it possible it didn't leak, especially in Israel?
Didn't what?
Leak.
Didn't leak. You also
especially in Israel.
You also had at the end, I think you had 2,000 people, more or less, who had signed confidentiality forms in Israel, and it still didn't leak. These were people who were read in, but I think there's a number. I think one of the real reasons it didn't leak was because people understood what was at stake. At the end of the day, we're not talking about another Hezbollah arms truck on its way from Syria to Lebanon. We're talking about the future of the Jewish state. A Syrian reactor would change everything. Had the potential to change everything. I think people realized the magnitude of what they were dealing with. In Israel, what Olmert initially began to do was to start to read in members of his security cabinet on an individual basis. Each one was brought to most times to his residence, to the Prime Minister's residence on Balfour Street in Jerusalem. Oftentimes, Meir Dagan or Amos Yadlin, the head of the military intelligence, were there as well to give the intelligence briefing, to show the information. Security cabinet members had to sign confidentiality forms as well. That was Olmert's way. He wanted to start to recruit individuals one by one. He also met with former prime ministers. He brought in Ehud Barak for a briefing. This was before Barak had joined. Barak in the middle joins the government because he wins the Labour Party primaries.
I got to interrupt. To see Barak in action, this brilliant fellow, he's a really complicated fellow. And when you watch this unfold in the story, you just see what he's doing and what he's not doing and what he's arguing against and what he's arguing for.
Yeah. The two Ehuds go at it almost from the get-go. Olmert felt that Barak was trying to undermine him. Barak felt that Olmert was stupid. I mean, that's the easiest way to say it. And therefore they were really just going at it from the beginning. But anyhow, he brought in Netanyahu, he brought in Bibi, he brought in Barak, he brought in Peres. He briefs all of them. He tries to get buy-in from everybody. He understands that this is what he might need to do. And this is still what the Americans are considering. But he wants to try to build up, and he starts security cabinet meetings. And they start going over the intelligence, and they start debating until everything culminates on a security cabinet meeting on September 5th, when they gather for several hours. Olmert gives every member the opportunity to speak. He's already prepared because Barak, I mean, just to give you one little snippet of what happened with him and Barak. At one point during a cabinet meeting in August, Ehud Olmert had asked the IDF to present the latest PowerPoint presentation on what's going on and where they're at, what are the options again, etc. And Barak, in a power play, says to this general, Ido Nehushtan, who later on becomes the head of the Air Force, sit down, I didn't give you permission to speak, in front of the cabinet. So Olmert, Ido Nehushtan sits down, because he's listening. His commander is the defense minister. Ehud Olmert sees what's going on. Now, what Barak didn't know is that Olmert had sat with Ido the night before, had gone over the PowerPoint presentation. So Olmert said, no problem, I'll present it to the cabinet, because he knew it already. Later, Barak goes back to his office and writes a letter, sends it by a courier to Ehud Olmert, because no, they can't talk by phone, right? So he sends him a letter saying this is unacceptable, I'm the defense minister, you can't, meet with officers. So Olmert sends him back a letter. Ehud Barak sends him back a letter. They exchange, I think, 7 letters. 7 letters in the span of a couple of days. I mean, we're dealing with a mess, like a serious issue. And this is what these politicians are dealing with, right? Now, I mean, on the one hand, it's sad. On the other hand, it's the reality. This is what happens in a cabinet and in politics and in Israeli politics, right? So you had that going on. Olmert, I think, ran an exemplary system here, really to his credit. He really went, he played it by the book. He went through each individual. He gave the updates. He stayed quiet. He stayed focused. I think really to his credit, and that was one of the big surprises for me when I did the research on this book. I spent a lot of time with him, and people could say, you drank his Kool-Aid, which could happen. But the thing is, when I hear it from everyone else, except for Barak, right, and that makes sense. Barak was the only person who did not have good things to say about Olmert. When I hear it from everyone else, when I hear it from everyone on the American side, right, when I'm hearing from the Vice President of the United States how they were blown away by the way Olmert ran this whole thing, then something was right.
So now they bomb it successfully. But this now comes another moment with an enormously dramatic and tense moment in the book. Is after the reactor is destroyed. So there are like a couple of questions here. Why didn't the radar or satellite technology, whatever technology Syria had, didn't pick up these planes flying across Syria to the northeast part of Syria? And what were the military preparations? Because Adlin is saying there's a chance that Syria is going to attack us. And maybe Hezbollah will attack us. So how did they prepare military reserves without it getting out that this could be a major war?
You guys, you ever see the movie Wag the Dog with Robert De Niro and Dustin Hoffman? Where I think it's Dustin Hoffman is the movie producer, De Niro is the spin doctor. I have it the opposite. Whatever it is, they come up with a fake war to distract the U.S. public from this presidential scandal. So in Israel, they basically had to do the same because they had to prepare for a war with Syria. Now remember, you had framed it perfectly in the beginning. We're a year after the Second Lebanon War, right? We had fought a war that they found, the government, the Commission of Inquiry, found failures and flaws from the top all the way down to the bottom. And now they're still rehabilitating, still rebuilding the IDF, repairing, and now they might be facing a war not against Hezbollah, but against the largest conventional enemy that Israel has. And this is 2007, when Syria still has all of its chemical weapons, all of its Scud missiles, its army's intact, all its tanks, more tanks than Israel, more soldiers than Israel. How do you prepare for that? So they had to come up with some wild ideas, right? that Syria might be thinking that they can attack us because of the way are showing in this Lebanon war. And they started to just spread stories. I was on the receiving end because I was the military reporter at the time. And I remember only later, it took me years to realize all this, that they were leaking to us nonsense, right? Just to get us. I mean, I was once fed a story about how in Syria, soldiers were being given motorcycles and anti-tank missiles because they had learned from Hezbollah that they were going to drive around now in motorbikes and shoot off anti-tank missiles. I don't think it was necessarily true, but they were feeding stories like this all across the press, right? So that was one thing they did. With regards to the radar detection, as you asked, just one word about I met the pilots, and they're
How many?
well, you had four F-15s, four F-16s, right? But these are, this is like in Hebrew we have the saying melech haaretz, salt of the earth. That's these guys, right? And you're just impressed. People really high quality. Young, you had young 20-year-olds pilots who had just finished the pilot's course, 45-year-old reservists, everyone together flying. And they had been training for a couple of months, but they were never told what their target was. They were told it's far away. So in their minds, they're like painting, they're drawing this imaginary circle around Israel. Where could it be? Where are they sending us? Hundreds of kilometers away. They don't know, but they keep on training. Only the bombing took place just after midnight, September 6th. So only the afternoon of September 5th. We're talking 5-6 hours before they fly off on their mission.
What's the message that he gives what's the message that I think the head of the Air Force gives?
Shkedi.
Yeah, gives these pilots?
Well, I mean, he comes down there, he shakes everyone's hand. He tells them, I believe in you. Yeah. He tells them you're embarking on a mission to save and secure the continued existence of the state of Israel. I mean, he speaks to these pilots. I still, I get the chills thinking about it again. But when they get that news that they're going off to bomb a nuclear reactor, I mean, you can imagine what they're carrying now on their shoulders, right, to go do this. How did they do it? So Ehud Barak, I'll tell you by a story of Ehud Barak. Ehud Barak, he's obviously in the military headquarters throughout the night. He comes home in the morning. He was living in one of these apartment towers overlooking the Ayalon Expressway in Tel Aviv. And I think he was living then on the 23rd floor. And he goes out to his balcony to have a cup of coffee, I guess, and he's standing there and he's looking out at Tel Aviv and he's looking and thinking about what could have been or what could still happen if Assad decides to let loose the Scud missiles. And then he realizes that all those fighter jets had literally flown all the way to Syria, lower than where he's standing right now on the 23rd floor of his apartment. So how'd they avoid detection? They flew pretty damn low.
You say 200 feet.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it was, the whole way there, right? Until then they get over the reactor, they got to climb to be able to drop their bombs. They drop their bombs, and once they do that, they're detected. So Syria did fire off air defense missile systems, but they were nowhere near the aircraft. The planes got the hell out of there, and they skirted along the Syrian-Turkish border, and then you have the side story of where they dropped some of their fuel tankers because they carried extra fuel. They landed in Turkish territory. That set off a little mini crisis with the Turks, but that's how they did.
So I don't like what-if questions, but I can't help myself. What if Israel hadn't bombed the reactor? As we now know, 5 or 6 years later, Syria is in disarray. There's basically this revolution. The country is in real crisis. ISIS, in fact, has taken a big piece of territory not that far from this reactor. Iran has its Revolutionary Guards in Syria. This would have had devastating consequences.
I think you're 100% right. I think that when you look at this story, you have to ask the what if question. Because it's what if Israel had not acted? Israel did not just save itself, I think. Israel saved the world. Because when in 2011 civil war broke out in Syria, the people took to the streets. So in 2014, ISIS takes over the Deir Azur region in Syria where the reactor was. Now imagine the reactor had still been there. They'd get their hands on a nuclear reactor. And even if there weren't yet bombs, radioactive material, I mean, imagine what ISIS could have done with this, right? That's one. Two, Assad himself look at what brutality he has demonstrated in the last 8 years of the Civil War. Over 500,000 people murdered, killed in fighting, dropping chemical weapons or what remained of his chemical weapons on his own people. What would have stopped him from using a nuclear weapon? What would have stopped him from using a dirty bomb? Who knows what he was capable of? He surprised the world. I remember when Barack was still defense minister, in the beginning days of the so-called Arab Spring, a number of times Barack said, Assad's days are numbered. He'll be out, I mean, you remember this, he'll be out in a couple of weeks, couple of months. He surprised the world. He surprised the world with his brutality, he surprised the world with his resilience. But a lot of that was because there was no stop. He would do anything. So when you think about the what if, it's frightening. It's literally frightening.
So what would have been, if you had been sitting in those meetings with Bush, you had been working on the National Security Advisor team, what would have been your case for the United States to bomb that reactor?
Well, I could tell you what Dick Cheney's case was, which I think, in hindsight, he really was right. Right. Cheney had suspicions from the beginning. He was obviously the bigger hardliner within the administration. But he felt that this was America needed to do this because America needed to lead and needed to lead by example. That's number one. Number two is that this is a threat to the world. It's not an Israeli issue, right? This is a global issue, and America needs to deal with it. And number three, he understood, as Olmert understood, that America had an opportunity to send a message to the entire world, but specifically to two addresses, North Korea and the Iranians. If America, it's one thing for Israel to attack. We're the obvious, usual suspect, right? We did Iraq in '81 when Israel bombed the Syria reactor. Syria is just over our border. Of course, we'll do something. But if the United States takes action, the Iranians have to think really hard if they're going to continue with their own nuclear program. And you talk about North Korea. Look at how they've been playing with the world in the years since. Just this past week, testing another ballistic missile. They got away with the greatest act of nuclear proliferation known to mankind without paying a price. And I tell this story here in the book of how they go, this diplomat, Chris Hill, who ran the six-party talks, because those were the negotiations the U.S. was running at the time with North Korea, goes to Beijing a few weeks after the bombing, shows this guy Kim Kwai-Gwan, who was the North Korean nuclear negotiator, shows him the photos, says, what the hell is this? And he basically, and Gwan says, it's all fake. But like they took him out, they put him away. Not only that, they removed North Korea from the list of states that sponsor terrorism. Trump put them back on in 2017. So then when you look at North Korea, at that point in time, North Korea had tested one nuclear device in October of 2006. Bush had warned that if they're caught transferring technology, they're going to pay a price. Well, they were caught, and they paid no price. They were rewarded. On the contrary, they were rewarded. And then you look through the Obama years, from 2009 to 2016, they tested 4 more bombs. And then in 2017, another bomb. So tell me that this didn't teach them a bad lesson. It taught them a terrible lesson. And I don't know that you could have stopped them. I don't know what could have been. But what I do know is that this shows us just how important it is to stop the Iranians now. Because if North Korea can't be stopped anymore, even after proliferating nuclear technology, America couldn't stop them. How are you going to stop the Iranians once they have nuclear weapons?
Okay, last bit of gossip. It isn't gossip because this is history. But I think we'd all be interested in understanding the vastly different reactions on the part of the President's national security team. So how would you characterize Rice and Gates versus Bush and Cheney in their reactions to Israel wanting to, at that point in time, take this act on their own?
So I'll say openly, there were 3 people in the administration who refused to meet with me, right? And I tried so many different ways to get to them. George Bush, Condoleezza Rice, and Bob Gates. And I think it comes as no surprise that those are the 3 who, no matter what I tried to get to, would refuse to meet with me. Because those are the three who, and I didn't come in with, people will say I took an opinion, I took an approach, that's fine. People could say whatever they want. But I came in with really no preconceptions or judgment. But they, in my opinion, and I think the story tells it as it is, they come out on the wrong side of history here. Those three, especially. Bush a little less, but Rice and Gates for sure. Rice had this idea that Israel needs to be weak and needs to be dependent on the United States, and only that way can we get Israel to do what we want it to do. And I heard it. First of all, she writes a bit about it in her own memoirs, but I got the full story and what she said in the he said she said from her staff, and from the people who were in the room with her. That was the approach that she took to this. If we let Israel act, if we act on behalf of Israel, forget about it, right? They control us, and if we let them do it, then then they're controlling us too.
So what did she want? What did she want to do?
Well, she wants to go to the UN. She wants to go to the Vienna. She's got this whole plan there. She also, don't forget, September of 2007. So that's when we attack. What happens in November, if you remember, the Annapolis conference, right? That was a great success. With Olmert. Olmert comes to America, goes to Annapolis. Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas comes. The Syrians even send, I think, their deputy ambassador or something like that here in the United States. They attend. This is another way to try to kickstart the peace process, which then again failed. But that's where Condi wanted them. Condi wanted Israel weak and subservient to some extent to the United States. Gates was also a little complicated. He even classified himself as being pro-Israel. He calls himself pro-Israel, and he came to Israel. He came to Israel.
Some of my best friends are Jews.
Right. Yeah. He came to Israel Secretary of Defense. In the first time in a long time, the Secretary of Defense did not come to Israel. But with that said, he felt that Olmert had way too much pull over and sway over the president. Even after the president holds the final meeting in what they call the Yellow Oval, it's up in the residence. A lot of these meetings, by the way, that Bush held were not in the Oval Office. They were held up in the residence, off books, not on anyone's schedule. No one could know about it. Just the small little team. Everything was done by everything was written down on hand notes. Elliot Abrams. He was the official note taker. He tells a story of how after one of these meetings, he forgot his notebook under his chair. He finds himself back in his office in the executive building across the street, directly opposite the Oval Office, the West Wing, dashes back inside, gets there, feels like he's about to be, if they catch him, they shoot him because he forgot these notes there. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But the meeting ends. Bush says, okay, this is what's going to happen. We'll offer it to the president, to the prime minister. And then he calls the prime minister. Gates still tries to get Bush, after Bush tells Olmert, okay, if you're going to do it, go ahead. He still tries to get him to put the brakes on Israel. That Israel can't act on its own. We need to give them a red light. And then there's Cheney. Cheney I spoke about before, who I think was really, took the right approach. And Bush was in a difficult position. To Bush's credit, he didn't try to stop Olmert. There's that phone call that takes place on July 13th. You got Bush in the Oval Office. Hadley and Abrams are there also on the phone, listening in. Olmert's in his office in Jerusalem. He's got two staffers who are also listening in. Bush says to Olmert, I've decided to, this diplomatic approach. He explains it to him. He says, I'm going to send you Condi. We'll come on Monday. You guys will hold a press briefing, blah, blah, blah. Olmert says to him, unacceptable. If you want to attack, I will attack. Elliot was sure that when Bush puts down the phone, he's going to be really upset. How dare the Israeli prime minister talk back to him like that? But Bush puts down the phone and says, I like this guy. He's got big, and I'll let you finish the line. But Hadley explained to me that this very much fit into Bush's a personality. He appreciated leaders who stood up for their convictions, who stood by what they believed, who stood up for what they felt was right. And that's why he had this really great relationship with Olmert.
Okay, I think you can see it's a pretty interesting book. At least I hope you think it's interesting. And the way you can find this interesting further is you can buy it. I always plug books.
Thank you, Roger.
Guys spend their time writing this, and the least we could do, even if you don't read it, is buy a copy, because they can use the money.
Buy two.
So we have a little bit of time for questions.
It's a great question. I think we have partners, but to a certain extent. I think the lesson that I walked away with from this book, and the way I end the book, that my last line in the book pretty much is that saying by Hillel the Elder from the time of the Mishnah 2,000 years ago, which in Hebrew was, Im ein ani li mili. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? That is, I think, the primary lesson you learn from this book, is that when it comes to Israel's security, there is no such thing as an international security situation, right? Where the international community comes to your rescue. It's about what you have to do on your own and how you make those tough decisions. And by the way, this is where Roger, what I said at the beginning about helping me frame that ending and this is where Roger helped me, was that this was what Olmert did ultimately, was he sent a message of how someone in an impossible situation can make an impossible decision. Because there's no, look, you think back to Olmert for a second, right? The criminal investigations a year after the war, he's got the president of the United States who says to him, I got your back, man. I'll take care of it. Now, it's not the answer you wanted, but I'm going to take it to the IAEA, I'm going to take it to the UN, and if they don't comply, I'm going to bomb it. So with his weakened position, Olmert could have said, B'vakasha, go for it. I'm with you, right? And he would have had cover because he has America who's saying, I'm going to take care of it. But he still, no one would have been able really to blame him for that. But he stood up and he said, no, this has got to go away. Because he understood. He saw something, I don't know that other people would have seen it. People have asked me, would Bibi have made the same decision? I don't know. I don't know, because I don't know, only when you're there. It's the story of your life. It's like Menachem Begin in 1981. He decides to attack the Syria reactor. Other people were opposed, right? Shimon Peres tried to stop him. We all know that story, right? The U.S. suspends delivery of F-15s afterwards. We get condemned at the UN Security Council. The whole world was against us. But Begin saw something that other people didn't. Would other people have done the same thing? Maybe, maybe not. But it's these people, it's their life story, it's what leads them, it's what they come with and leads them to this moment that everything together is what brings them to this decision. Israel discovered, as it gathered intelligence on Syria, that Assad had kept this a secret from almost everyone in the government. His own cabinet didn't know about it. His own chief of staff didn't know about it. A select few. There was one general whose name is Muhammad Suleiman, who sat in an office down the hall from Assad, was very close to him. I tell the story how later, in 2008, he's shot dead by Israeli Navy commandos as he's sitting on the porch of his vacation, his seaside resort home in the town of Tartus in Syria. But anyhow, no one knew about it. So Israel figured that if they destroy it and they stay quiet and they don't embarrass Assad, Assad might prefer to sweep it under the rug and pretend nothing happened. Because the last thing he needs is for his people to see that he's spending billions of dollars on some adventure when they got high unemployment, high inflation, don't have what to eat, don't have how to pay their bills. So they gambled right, and it worked. That's why Israel for 10 years, can you imagine this is Israel? Right? Can you imagine, you mentioned before not speaking. Ehud Olmert is fighting for, not political survival, he's fighting to not go to jail. He ends up going to jail. Would other politicians not have pulled this out and said, I saved this country, and now you're sending me to jail, right? I don't think so. That, by the way, I said to him once, I said, Olmert, I think one of the greatest things that you did was you never spoke. I don't know how you did. I don't know how you held back, right? You're facing down, forget about the end of your political career. You're looking at a time in jail, and you never say a word about it because he understood what was at stake. It was bigger than him. We definitely need to stop them. Someone needs to stop them. They need to be stopped. Iran is it's a whole different level of a threat. Iran learned the lessons of Osirak and of Al-Kibar. That was the name of this reactor. These were single facilities above ground. They've scattered their facilities throughout the country, some of them deep underground, like Natanz, Qom, and others. Much more complicated. It's farther away than Syria. This is just over the border. not a complicated military operation. Iran is much more complicated. But I still think, from what I know, from what I've seen, and I've been in these briefings with the Air Force where they've laid out the maps and showed us which squadron would go where in a potential operation, they claim they can do it, they can cause enough damage. But it's only enough damage to set them back, right? Ultimately, the know-how is there, and they'll be able to rebuild. So the question has to come, what comes after, right? The Iranians aren't just going to sit back, right? And there will be retaliation, and let's say we'll manage with that, right? Hezbollah, okay, we'll manage with that. That's not an existential threat. That'll be terrible. That's not an existential threat to the state of Israel. A nuclear Iran is for a number of reasons. One is the possibility one day they'll use it. Two is the nuclear arms race it would set off. And three is it would impair Israel's operational freedom. I mean, we have what happened in Gaza just last week, right, this past weekend. Let's say that happens again and Israel wants to go into Gaza and do something. And the Iranians say, if you cross that border, we'll drop a nuclear bomb over Tel Aviv. What do? Right? You can't live with this reality. So I hope we never get to that situation. I think what's happening now, and you kind of see this, right? So the U.S. sent the Lincoln Strike Force they crossed the Suez to the Gulf. The president has imposed new sanctions on the steel. Just the other week, he got rid of all the waivers on the oil exports. America wants to get the Iranians back, and Trump spoke about it today. He wants the Iranians to come back to the table and renegotiate a better deal. We got to hope they do, because this deal is bad. Even if they stick to it, which now they just said the other day they're not going to, but even if they do stick to it, while it gives us a little breather, ultimately when it ends, they will be a jump away from a nuclear bomb, literally within weeks, if not days.
So let me just put this question in. It's in the book, so now we go a couple of years forward, and Bibi is the president. Bibi is prime minister, and Bibi in the cabinet wants to get the military, put them on alert for a potential attack against Iran. The head of the Mossad, Maya Dagan, and the head of the military, Gabi Ashkenazi, both of them...
A new member of Knesset.
What?
A new member of Knesset.
But both of them were involved in 2007. Both of them stand up and say, you're violating Israeli law. We haven't gotten full support. It hasn't gone through the National Security Cabinet.
They tried.
Here is Dagan going, and at one point, obviously, really one of the heroes of the 2007 attack. And here, he's going to Bibi and saying, and he went public. He went public.
Yes, he did.
So how do you square that?
First of all, they didn't like Bibi. I mean, no. To say it mildly, they didn't like him. They liked Olmert more than they liked Bibi. I think there was that personal element possibly to it. But there's also, when they had held there was a security cabinet meeting at Mossad headquarters. And at the end of this security cabinet meeting, as everyone had gotten up to leave, suddenly Bibi says to Ashkenazi, I want you to put the army on high alert. Within 30 days, we have to be ready for an attack against Iran. As if like off the cuff. Now, it broke every protocol, because if you want to attack another country and you want to go on an operation of this kind, you need to get the security cabinet. Netanyahu's the prime minister, but he is not the sovereign authority within Israel. That's the cabinet. And it has to go through the cabinet. It did not go through the cabinet. So Dagan that's what Ashkenazi says, if you do this, they will detect it and it will lead us to war. And we're going to be in a war. And Dagan is even more harsh. He's harsher. He says to him, this is against the law what you're doing. And that really ended Dagan's career. At that point, his tenure had been extended. At that point, that was pretty much, he knew he was on his way out. And he ultimately was on his way out. I think that they understood that Iran was of a different scale. They felt there was still more time, and that the international community could still do something. That was their opinion. Whether they're right or wrong, we still don't know, because the Iranian story is not yet over. Well, Israel has attacked in Syria hundreds of times in recent years, we know about. It's reduced, it's dropped in the last couple of months. And you'll remember that a few months ago, a Russian plane was shot down by a Syrian air defense missile. And the Russians then blamed the Israelis because Israel had just attacked another Iranian target in Syria, that they used the Russian plane to cloak their radar. And that set off a big crisis. Netanyahu has gone to Moscow a couple of times, has tried to, at first Putin didn't want to meet him. If you remember, a few months ago, Netanyahu went to some meeting in Paris, which was something that he never would have attended. It was all just to try to get a couple minutes with Putin, right? Putin was not willing to talk to him. Now things are a little better, but Israel is much more restrained than it used to be. When there are high-level targets, it finds ways to try to act, but much lower profile, below the radar, not like it used to be. And with that said, that coordination mechanism still exists. You know, I'll tell you something. In Israel, in Tel Aviv, where the Kiryat is, the defense ministry, and the military headquarters, right across from the Azrieli Towers off the Ayalon freeway, underground is what's known as the Bor. That's the Hebrew for pit. It's the underground command center. And in there, 24/7, sits an IDF officer, Russian-speaking, who's got a hotline that connects him directly to Tartus, to the Russian base in Tartus, where a Russian officer sits. And if I had told you a couple of years ago that you'd have a hotline in the most sensitive command center in Israel, connects to Syria, we never would have believed that this is even possible. This is the mosaic of the Middle East today. It's a whole other world. It's a whole other reality. And you know, we have to learn to live with it, but I'll just throw one other piece of information into it. This is why it's important that America stays in Syria. And I try not to tell America what to do.
What you're going to do.
But I'm going to do it now anyhow, because you know, when Trump said he's pulling them out, he's keeping them in, and I think that's still like undecided. It's unclear exactly what they're doing. If America disengages, the Russians are there, and you know, let's be honest, the Russians have only one friend, and that's the Russians. They don't care about Israel as much as, you know, that their alliance with us is an interest-based alliance. We need an engaged America because we need to counter what could potentially happen if that vacuum is created in the Middle East. They're as ready as can be. I can tell you, you know, the book had to go through, in Israel, we have something called the military censor, right? And any story of national security had to go to the censor and has to be approved by the censor. And the censor, until a year ago, was still banning any publication on this story. And I started working on this in 2016 because I felt that we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary, and I wanted to write a story for my newspaper. And I knew about the censor, but there's a way to bypass the censors. You talk to foreign sources. That's why I started meeting only with Americans. I said, I'm not going to talk to a single Israeli. Only Americans, and only on the record that I can quote them, because then the censor can't erase what they say. Then as I started to meet with the Americans, I discovered what's going on here. I said, this isn't a story, this is a book. And I couldn't hold back. I had to start meeting with Israelis. But I'm meeting with Israelis, now I'm getting into trouble. So I go to meet with the censor. And I know her for 15 years. She's a brigadier general. She used to be her name is Ariella Ben Avraham. She used to be in the IDF spokesperson's office. And I go to her and I tell her what I'm doing, which is not often done. You know, you don't go to the censor and get pre-approval. I've written a couple of books. I send them stories every day as the editor of the paper. But I felt like I'm not going to waste my time. You know, I don't have that much time anyhow, and I'm not going to waste it on doing something, and then they're never going to let me publish it. So I go to her and I tell her what I've done. I tell her where I'm at. I say, I feel like I'm down a rabbit hole. If you tell me, Yaakov, there's no chance in hell, I'm going to stop. And she said to me, don't stop. I said, so you mean one day you're going to lift the bench? She said, I didn't say that, but don't stop. So I kind of saw it, talk about green lights, red lights. I saw it as a yellow, orange light or something. So I kept on going. And then they lifted the ban after I had sent them the book, whatever. But I mentioned the censor because that question, there's a lot of pieces there that they had cut out. One of the pieces, because they're not in the room right now, is Israel is, after the Second Lebanon War, we're still replenishing our munitions, right? You have, in the span of a couple of weeks, in the summer of 2007, massive freighters of ships that are coming into Israel and are bringing huge stockpiles of munitions. Huge. From the United States, which is a whole separate story in of itself. Couldn't tell it in the book.
What about 2019?
What?
What about 2019? Are they still
2019. I mean, no, obviously that's the relationship that goes on, but it would have just given away some of the ways that this happens. And you had some of these ships that were coming and bringing with it a lot of these weapons. You had a lot of other stuff that were going on. Israel was getting ready for a massive war. And that was part of it. Another thing that they did was they started training again in the Golan Heights, which is something that they hadn't done for years. A lot was happening. They were trying to get the forces ready, but they were going to be as ready as they could be. I mean, you know, that would have been the reality. How that war would have looked, thank God we don't know, right? Someone wrote a book about Stuxnet. Stuxnet, the problem, I'll tell you the problem with Stuxnet was this virus that Israel worked on together with the United States, the NSA together with Shmona Matayim, 8200 in Israel, and the Mossad. And it infected Natanz and the uranium enrichment facility in Iran. By the way, you know how it worked? It was so sophisticated that, so they got it into the uranium enrichment center, which is a whole story in of itself. But what it did is the centrifuges are controlled by these massive Siemens control systems. And it showed the operators that everything was fine, but what it really did was it played around with the frequency of how the centrifuges spin around. And centrifuges are very sensitive machines. So it had to go up a few degrees, then drop a few degrees in the frequency of the way it spun, and that was enough to break it. No one talks about Stuxnet still in Israel. No one. But I will tell you one story, and with this we can end. Amos Yadlin, who was the head of military intelligence, during this whole story, and he's really one of the main characters of the book. We didn't talk a lot about him, but he's up there with Dagan as well. He was one of the pilots who bombed the Syria reactor in 1981. He's from the Air Force. He was one of the guys who flew there with Ilan Ramon. You remember our first astronaut who sadly was killed in re-entry to Earth in 2003. Yadlin was one of those pilots. So Yadlin, you go to his office, and he has on the wall a citation. It's kind of like, it's not a medal, but it's like a certificate of honor or citation or something that he got from the head of the NSA for participating in an operation together with them for something, right? There's only one person in the world who has taken part and basically led attacks, and not on one reactor, not on 2 reactors, but on 3 reactors. That's Amos Yadlin, right? So he was involved in Osirak as a pilot. He was involved in Al-Kibar as the head of military intelligence, as one of the planners. And that citation on his wall, when I said to him, that's Stuxnet, I only got a smile. But that's what I'm guessing. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roger.
Ladies and gentlemen.